Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Ethos Online. Again, this is a space where you can be, belong, and become the very best version of yourselves. So, wherever you're joining us today, we just want to say thank you for just taking a little bit of time with us. Thank you for moving through these beautiful compilations, stories, books that we call the Bible. Right? All of these beautiful pieces of wisdom to share of how to live a fuller, better life. And so, thank you again for joining us. We are in this series over Genesis. And so, if you would click that little subscribe button there at the bottom, share this video if it connects with you in any way. Share this video. Again, this is the year we're going to grow this YouTube channel. We're going to focus a little more on YouTube. So, please share that. And if you want to continue to financially donate, help us continue what we're doing, there's a link there as well. So, everyone, again, welcome to Ethos Online. Again, a space where we deconstruct, we reconstruct, we find deep, deep meaning, deep, deep purpose. And so, Genesis, again, oftentimes considered the book of origin. Many people will often associate it with like a history book. It couldn't be further from the truth, right? It is not a history book. It was not written to show factual evidence, dates, times, all of those things. That was never the point of writing Torah, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Secondly, this is a book written by a group of Jewish people, right? We called them Hebrews back then, a very small, very nomadic tribe of people. In fact, historically, we know from archaeological studies, we know Israel is it's a pretty young group actually onto the scene, right? We have Egypt, Babylon, others who have been there a lot longer, Syria, and so Israel is kind of this new kid on the block historically. And so all of that to say, if you don't know anything about Judaism, if you haven't studied anything about the Hebrew culture and their actual history, really difficult to pick up this piece and read it without without adding a lot of our own present day context to it, right? There have been thousands of years of interpretation over this book, right? The Bible, we call it the Bible, Genesis through Revelation. Thousands of years of interpretation, and the last couple, the last 100, 300, 400 years have really been only interpreted by non-Jewish people. Think about that. And so fascinating when you think about this. The Jewish people who actually wrote these pieces, their book, their stories, their poetry has been taken by a different group of people. And this different group of people, just over the last couple hundred years, have claimed to be the experts over the actual authors. And so, what I, again, find so important right now to do is take time to study who the Jewish people are, right? Study their historical context, authorship, audience, all of it. And only then, after I do the responsible study, can I actually then begin to find applications. If I start only looking at the last couple hundred years of interpretation, I am missing out on a plethora of really important information that's actually going to help me be a more responsible reader. And so I do the research. I take so many hours during the week to try to put this together for you. And so I don't take it lightly. All of that to say, again, I don't take it lightly. I really spend a lot of time. And so if you find a connection or a question that pops up, please email me over this as we continue moving through this really beautiful book, Genesis. So again, reminder, Genesis. Genesis is written because Israel falls into captivity from the Babylonians, 587 BC. Right? Temples destroyed. We're going to see this happen over and over to them. Their temples destroyed. Their culture's kind of basically almost been demolished, right? They are taken into Babylon, and like any other country, any other nation, any other tribe, they're going to assimilate, right? Except for Israel, here's the thing, they don't. They choose not to assimilate. They want to hold on to their traditions, hold on to their identity. And so that's why they compile Torah, right? Again, poetry, mythology. I know that word kind of scares some of you, but it's a bigger word, meaning like there was a story about, this person, and before you know it, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and he was swallowed by a whale. I think you guys get it, right? Prophetic musings, prophetic warnings, all there. And again, it's all there for a message for a tribe of people called Israel. And so Israel will find themselves in this story over and over again. It's kind of a reminder again, I was a lit major as well. I studied theology as well as literature. And what I found with literature is what's interesting is when you study literature and you understand the author and you know some stories about the author's life, what you'll find is the author, for instance, Charles Dickens, he will insert himself in the stories over and over again. What he's doing is he's retelling his own story through different characters. Oliver Twist, um, Pip from Great Expectations, he will retell his own story through different stories, different scenarios, different characters, but it's really ultimately going to be his story repeated over and over again. And the only way you know that is if you know about the life of Charles Dickens. And so, again, we study the life of the Hebrews, we study their language. So, we are on chapter 12, and this is a really interesting one, kind of a confusing one, an interesting way to start kind of in the movement of Abraham, right? So, a reminder last week we talked about Abraham. Abraham literally means father. He is a better word for it in today's interpretation. Abraham is the founder. So, according to most rabbis, Jewish rabbis, Abraham would have been considered one of the first messianic characters, right? He is the first messianic model that's going to take Israel from a place of like hardship, idolatry, those kind of things. He's going to take Israel from there and bring them to here, a place of wholeness. We might use the word home, right? So he's going to move them from here to here. That's what a messianic individual is going to do. And so he's stepping away from tradition. And that's a really difficult thing to do. Anyone that's ever had to do that knows you take your lumps. It's uncomfortable. People are questioning you. Are you sure you know? But you step out in faith, right? You step outside into that brand new world, and it's scary. And this is what Abraham does. He steps away from a polytheistic tradition into a monotheistic one. That alone, historically, very rare do you see that in tribes. And this is what Israel does. So right from the get-go, they are a group of people who say, tradition, we're going to step out a little bit. And that's what they do. So here we go. Let me read you Genesis 12, 10 through 20. It goes like this. There was a famine in the land, and Abram descended to Egypt to sojourn there because the famine was severe in the land. Now it came to pass when he drew near to come to Egypt that he said to Sarah his wife, Behold, now I know that you are a woman of fair appearance. And it will come to pass when the Egyptians see you that they will say, This is his wife, and they will slay me and let you live. Please say that you are my sister, in order that it go well for me because of you, and that my soul may live because of you. And it came to pass when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman that she was very pretty. And Pharaoh's princes saw her, and they praised her to Pharaoh. And the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh. And he benefited Abram for her sake. And he had flocks and cattle and donkeys and men servants and maidservants and she donkeys and camels. And the Lord plagued Pharaoh with great plagues as well as his household on account of Sarah, Abram's wife. And Pharaoh summoned Abram and he said, What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her to myself for a wife? And now here is your wife. Take her and go. And Pharaoh commanded men on his behalf, and they escorted him and his wife and all that was his. So, very odd story, right? In a nutshell, to summarize, basically Pharaoh's scared. And he's afraid they're going to kill him. So he whores out his wife. And then he gets a bunch of gifts. And then he gets in trouble for it, found out, and then he's told to leave. Interesting story, right? What an odd story. Where do we get this? What do we get from this, right? How do we interpret it? What message can I apply from this? And what's the deeper message for Israel? So all of those questions I'm going to attempt to answer right here. So let's move through this verse by verse, and just let me show you some interesting concepts. And again, I'm going to borrow pretty heavily from different rabbinical writings and interpretations, as well as just looking at some of the Hebrew words and sharing just some interesting concepts and insight into this story. So here we go. First off, one thing and most rabbis actually will notice from the get go is this: and there was a famine in the land. Now remember, Abram leaves, right? He leaves his home and he's going to Canaan. And again, Canaan is the place of plenty. It's the thing you need, the MacGuffin effect, right? If I could only have this, I would be happy, right? It's where we're all heading. It's the concept of heaven. It's the thing. It's where we're gonna go. It's where shalom will be found, right? Tikkun olam, nothing missing, nothing broken. The world is healed. Canaan, that's what that means. And so watch this now. Abraham and his whole family, right? All these people who said we're stepping away from tradition and we're going to Canaan. We're going to find wholeness. We're going to find it here. You step away and you get to Canaan. The problem is, of course, Canaan now has a famine. There are hardships there. It's not the perfect place, is it? Yeah. Some of you know this from experience. You left the job, right? You left the thing because it wasn't working. So you stepped away and you had all these great ideas of what life was going to look like. Right? You stepped away from a tradition, a toxic relationship, whatever. And you thought that everything was going to be rainbow and butterflies, right? Everything's going to be so good now that I left the thing. Except the problem is that's not how life works, is it? It didn't work for the Israelites, and it probably doesn't work for you that way either, because life happens, right? You step away and you only got new problems, new obstacles, and that's just how it is, right? It reminds me of this picture. I saw this picture of these guys surfing. Now, I lived in Southern California for a while. I tried surfing. I was miserable at it. I was the guy upside down in this picture. I tried over and over again to get the waves. And I remember so many friends telling me, Tony, you just have to relax, right? You just have to ride the wave. Except the problem was when I looked around, I saw half of the people riding the wave, and boy, did it look fun. And then the other half, like me, we were going, they call it over the falls. And when you go over the falls, that water is just, it's like you're inside of a washer. And you're just doing this over and over and over again. And riding the wave that way, not so fun. Being on top of it, only a couple times that I actually catch waves, that felt so good, so easy, so fun. But the majority of the time, I'm in a washer. Not sure I'm going to be able to come up out of the water to breathe, right? So there are two different kinds of people, I would argue, in the world. There's this guy who, again, falling over the waves, getting tumbled in the washer, having a really miserable time. And then there's this guy. He's just riding the wave. He's found a way to relax and enjoy the thing. And I think in life, this is what happens, right? For some of us, when we face discouragement, when we face obstacles, we had this idea that when we left home, when we left the thing, again, it was going to be so easy, everything's going to be perfect, it's all going to fall into place finally, but it didn't. And so for some of us, what happens is we thought it was going to look like Canaan, but instead, we stepped into a famine. And for some of us, we didn't handle that well, did we? We did not surf the waves. We stumbled, we fell, it was ugly and painful and messy. But there are other people, of course, when they experience difficulties, when they experience obstacles, they have found a way to relax and just ride the wave. So, two different ways of dealing with obstacles. I want so badly to be the guy that rides the wave. Or take the river analogy. Rather than fighting the river, just turning and allowing it to take you and go where it is, right? Wherever it takes you. That's a different way of living life. And so the question, of course, for Israel right here in this moment, where again, we're expecting Canaan, instead we got famine. For Israel, the question is, what do we do? Right? What happens next? How do we navigate this? How do we navigate famine? How do we navigate the obstacles, the promise that does not seem fulfilled? Right? We'll see this over and over again, this idea of a promise being given and then it not being fulfilled in our time. What do we do in the in-between? The liminal space, the time of waiting. Do we freak out? Do we go over the falls? or do we learn to surf and ride the wave? That's the question that Israel's going to have for themselves here. And truth be told, Genesis is ripe with these stories over and over. It's a cycle you're going to see over and over again as we move through the book. Watch this. Abraham descended to Egypt to sojourn there because the famine was severe in the land. So notice this first and foremost. Egypt is not the enemy yet, right? Egypt still represents biblically large empire, right? Beastly empire. They are the tribe, of course, that's different. They're the polytheistic tribe, right? Whereas Israel is monotheistic, one God, right? They have a lot of differences. One is holding on to traditions of human sacrifices. Israel at this moment has said, no, we don't do human sacrifices anymore. We are not a warring empire like Egypt. So vast differences, right? They're going in the opposite direction. If we're going to kind of use some terms that would be connected to what like Jewish people, how they would talk. One is moving east of Eden. One is moving toward Eden, right? Which direction do you choose? So Israel, the question for them is, we're stuck here, right? We have to go to Egypt, right? They have food they can provide, even though we don't want to be there, right? Much like Babylon, they get thrown into Babylon. But the question is, are we going to assimilate or not? Are we going to take on the characteristics of Egypt or not? And so are we going to become Egyptians, Babylonians, or are we going to hold true to our identity? And so for me, when I read this story, I immediately make that connection of Israel is asking themselves, what are we going to be? Who are we going to follow? What kind of people will we continue to be? What's our identity? So right now, what I see in our culture, I see this often. There is a deep temptation, fear, deception. I would argue all of this is happening, and we're seeing it. And the question, of course, for us as people who are saying, I want to be more Christ-like, when we see, the mass media, whichever direction you are with politics, I don't really care, to be honest. We're seeing so much mass media frenzy. And what is their currency? It's fear, right? If there was no fear in the media, we would not see a lot of stories. They would not be making a lot of money. But if they can get us scared about enough things, we tune in, don't we? It's the reason why whenever there's a tornado or some catastrophic event, right, people tune in and the ratings go up. And so right now in our culture, fear is currency. We see this with wars, right? Whenever someone drops a bomb, whatever it is, the media hype, the viewership, it drives the numbers up. Do we assimilate or not? Do we chew on that? Do we accept that at our table or not? This is the question for Israel. We have people like Cardi B, right, spreading their legs every chance they get for the television audience. What do we do with that? Do we choose to accept that? Is that the direction we want people moving? Is that the ethic we want to be viewing every day? Are those the kind of people we want as models for our new movement toward a civilized world? I don't know, right? For Israel, they would have said no, right? That would have been an empire that they would not be heading that direction. And so the question, of course, do we assimilate today or not? What do we choose to put on our plates? Right? What do we choose to consume and what do we choose not to? For Israel, this story is deeply about choosing not to participate in some things. And here's the warning. If we choose to participate, if we choose to live in a place that is filled, that's ripe with fear, unethical behavior, those kind of things, we will begin to assimilate and look like that. So let me continue, and we'll delve into that even more in a second. It came to pass when he drew near to come to Egypt, that he said to Sarah his wife, Behold now, I know that you are a woman of fair appearance. And it will come to pass when the Egyptians see you, that they will say, This is his wife, and they will slay me and let you live. So I want you to notice something here. This is, again, I grew up with the felt board. Right? Abraham and the stories, they were all told on the felt board. I heard my father's voice in the background, I saw these stories. Some of you now, you're watching, VeggieTales or whatever. But I would see these stories told on the felt board. I would watch these, and I don't remember this part of the story. right? For many of us, this is kind of new because you don't talk about this in church, right? You don't hear this interpretation. The truth is, here's what happens. Abraham is scared. Abraham is terrified, and he's making some really unethical decisions here. What he chooses to do, and we'll get to it in a minute, it actually is deeply Egyptian. It's what the Egyptians would do. It's what they would do in their culture. But Israel has said, we are moving in a different direction. We're choosing not to live that way. And yet, when he is in that culture, when he is faced with fear, right, anxiety, what does he do? Well, immediately he allows that fear to cause him to make some really poor decisions. And again, in our culture right now, fear, panic everywhere, right? Do we put on one mask, two masks, 8 masks? We're terrified of germs, right? So much so that we're over sanitizing is what science is showing us right now. Our own bacterium right now, we're terrified, right? We're so terrified that any kind of germs that are healthy for our bodies, we're actually terrified of, right? So we're actually ruining our own bodies in some ways by over sanitizing out of fear, right? Right now, mass shootings, right? The media is loving this. They love to share about these shootings that are taking place. And of course, they'll talk about Colorado, but they won't talk about Detroit, where they had, 8 to 40 people, I think, in the last couple of weeks shot. You're seeing this all over. But why is it at certain times, different points, they begin sharing more and less? The media thrives on conflict, right? The media is going to thrive on fear. Over and over again, we've lived through a crazy summer of riots and all of these things, whether it was at the Capitol or downtown Minneapolis. This is taking place over and over again where we live, right? Fear. And so when you are given the fear, how do you respond? Do you respond by putting 12 masks on? Do you respond by going outside and shooting up someplace because you're scared? Do you respond by saying we need to remove the rights of everyone? What is your response? Because if your response is one that's coming out of fear, unfortunately, that's not always a positive direction, is it? We typically don't respond well when fear is the motivator. And so Israel, whenever fear has been the motivator, they've made really poor decisions. And what an interesting warning to a tribal group of people. And what an interesting warning to us today. When you respond out of fear, when the fear is the driving force, and we haven't stopped and considered all the options, stopped and asked questions of the people we're fearing or the movements we're fearing, when we haven't stopped and had conversations, then ultimately we're going to move down some pretty bad territory, aren't we? We're going to find a lot of pain and brokenness. We're going to move away from Eden. I love some of these quotes. Here's one from Yoda. I found this one. I thought, this is great. This is really good. And it's funny. Fear is the path of the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. What an interesting quote right now. Right? With such a divided nation, such a divided world. If fear is what's motivating us, if it's the engine behind our actions, then no wonder there's more hate, more anger. No wonder so much is happening right now. When fear is the thing that's pushing us, driving us. Another quote that I find really fascinating. Fear is nothing more than an obstacle that stands in the way of progress. In overcoming our fears, we can move forward, stronger and wiser within ourselves. When I can remove fear from the equation, and let's be honest, fear is a good thing in some ways for lizard brain, right? Fear keeps me from choosing to jump off my roof with an umbrella trying to Mary Poppins it, right? Fear in those regards, yeah, animalistic instincts, perfect. But fear being my driving force to considering rational, logical things, yeah, really bad, right? That's not going to move me toward progress. It's actually going to move me the very opposite direction. And so fear cannot be the driving force behind decisions and things we decide to do, right? Behind our actions. One of the greatest quotes ever in the Bible, in the New Testament, perfect love casts out all fear, right? First John. I love this quote. When love is the thing, when love is the engine, when I love myself and my neighbors and the world around me, there's no room. If love is the main driving force, there's no room for fear. My decisions can then be based on love, right? Do I really love myself enough to make this decision that is healthier and better for me and my neighbors and the world, right? Those kind of things. That's a peaceful presence in the world. That's what Israel's feeling called to do. Be a presence of love, not fear, right? And again, this is where we get into Egypt, Babylon, Greece, Rome. Those nations, they drove the populace through fear. Whereas Israel says, no, no, no. We want to lead the world through love. What a difference, right? And Abraham is supposed to be, he's supposed to be that kind of symbol of Israel as the driving force of love in the world. However, he kind of blows it here, doesn't he? Please say that you're my sister in order that it will go well for me. Again, he's so scared, right? He's so scared because of you, and that my soul may live because of you. And it came to pass when Abram came to Egypt that the Egyptians saw the woman that she was pretty. Again, he panics. In Egyptian culture, it was very common that you would give your daughters, right, your sisters as gifts because women were commodities. And so you would give them as these sexual favors to the pharaohs and the princes. That was a very common thing in Egypt. Israel, not so much, right? They were very, well, on the surface, they were very monogamous, right? However, we did have some moments where they kind of blow it, right? But for the most part, women are not as much sexual commodities as Egypt has, right? Secondly, he lies. He just straight up lies to Pharaoh, right? He lies because he's so scared. And here's the other thing. Pharaoh's princes saw him and they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to the house of Pharaoh. Now, many of us, again, on the felt board, we didn't hear this. Taken to the house of Pharaoh would have meant she has now become a concubine. She is now in the bedchambers of Pharaoh, which means he slept with her, right? She is nothing more now than a concubine. So Abraham, in his fear, right? In his fear, he completely assimilates, totally crosses over to how Egypt does life, right? You could not assimilate anymore, right? He might as well put on the headdress. He has moved and assimilated. And this is for Israel reading this. Any Jewish person, they would have been shaking their heads like, oh, no, Abraham, no, don't do it, right? We're Israelites. We're not Egyptians. We don't do that, right? That would have been definitely eating from the plate of Pharaoh, right? That culture, consuming it completely. But this is what Pharaoh does. He is terrified. Fear becomes the driving force. And so, again, I wonder if you've ever been there. Right? You've been so panicked, so terrified, worried. You find yourself doing something you typically wouldn't do. Right? Some of us, we experienced some water crises in the past. When COVID-19 first hit, I remember going to Costco, and man, you could feel it in the air. Like there was this just low rising tension between people. If you were the guy that picked up the last bit of toilet paper, people gave you the eye, right? There was almost a death look like, I'm going to get you, right? How dare you take that last? That's what happens in crisis. Oftentimes people begin to lose it a little bit, right? Before you know it, you're arguing over a liter of water with someone and you're ready to go to toe with them, right? You're ready to start fighting there in the middle of Costco. Things can get ugly when fear is the driving factor. We can lose it. And again, I think we've all been there to some degree, especially over the last couple of years. Tensions are high. And when fear is the driving force, it can get ugly. How do you respond to panic? Fear is a physical thing. I know we often talk about fear as like an emotional thing, but scientifically, here's what they say about fear. Fear is a very physical thing as well. It does something to your body in a very physical way. So watch this. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released. Your blood pressure and your heart rate increases. Again, we're talking about fear, right? You start breathing faster. Even your blood flow changes. Blood actually flows away from your heart and into your limbs, making it easier for you to start throwing punches and run for your life. Again, this is what fear will often do. It'll cause us to use less of the gray matter and start turning into caveman again, right? When we allow fear, panic to drive us, we're no longer using that prefrontal cortex, are we? Yeah, we're beginning to simply use panic and lizard brain kicks in. What a warning to us now, right? Don't allow fear to be the driving force of what you do. Let me continue. And he benefited Abraham for her sake, meaning he gives Abraham gifts. He gives things to Abraham because of the gift he gives. Understand that. And he had flocks of cattle, donkeys, and men servants and maid servants and she donkeys and camels. He's given a ton of resources here. So think about this now. He assimilates, he does the wrong thing out of fear, and he's gifted. Like, talk about guilt and shame, like more and more shame. He whores out his wife. Like, just that alone. Deceives Pharaoh, and Pharaoh gives him a reward. I think about this picture right here, this picture of like this overflowing garbage can, right? I do one thing, it's bad, but before you know it, if you continue down that road where all of your actions are all motivated by fear, right? When we move down that road, it begins to pile up. And the sad thing is, for many of us, we won't notice how much is piled up until it's overflowing, until it's become such a problem that now, before, if you would have stopped it right there, it wouldn't have been a big deal. But now, like, there's a lot of cleanup. There's a lot of collateral damage, right? There are people that you've hurt. There's so many things that have happened in the past now that they've just been building. Because when you respond one way and it keeps building, you have a garbage can filled with junk, don't you? Yeah, it's bad. It can potentially get really, really full until it's too late. And this is what happens. The guilt and the shame are piled on. He's getting all these gifts. He knows he did the wrong thing, right? Yet he's still blessed. Like, what an interesting moment for Israel too. Like, even in your mistakes, there's still going to be blessing. Interesting, like, positive side to it. But let me continue reading. It says this, and the Lord plagued Pharaoh. Again, the plagues, you're going to see this come up again, right? In the Exodus story. You're going to see the plagues and all of this. Again, the themes reoccur over and over again. Whether you want to take it literal, symbolic, whatever, you're going to see these stories over and over again. Joseph, Abraham, Moses, the plagues, over and over again. So God plagues Pharaoh and great plagues as well as his household on account of Sarah, Abram's wife. And the Pharaoh summoned Abram and he said, "What is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I took her to myself for a wife? And now here is your wife. Take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded men on his behalf, and they escorted him and his wife and all that was his. First off, the irony here is rich. Like, don't forget this. If you're an Israelite and you're reading this, what you're seeing is fascinating. Pharaoh is the more ethical one in this moment. Like, Pharaoh, the leader of the beastly empire, is more ethical in this moment than the founder of your nation. How quickly and easily we fall when we choose not to follow the wisdom traditions of the past, when we choose to move against our own ethic, when we choose to let fear drive us and make decisions. Like, what a fall. Pharaoh is more ethical than the founder of Israel. That, first and foremost, as an Israelite, as a Jewish person reading this, you would have been so aware of this. It would have been a painful grimace as you're reading this. right? And another thing here, the lesson for Israel with all of this, the lesson here is we have to stay the course, right? We have to continue moving toward Canaan. We cannot keep going backwards into bondage, into captivity. We have to learn to trust, even though the promise is not fulfilled, right? We're in Canaan, there's famine, there's brokenness. We have to find a way to stay the course. We have to find a way to continue trusting, right? Trust that things are going to work out. Trust that we can make it through this thing. When we knee-jerk react, when we choose to go back to brokenness, and again, that's the concept of Egypt here, back to brokenness, back to pain. When we choose to go back, we find ourselves in brokenness, far from shalom. And so Abraham, again, the founder of Israel, the one that's the messianic character that's going to lead Israel to a deeper, fuller, meaningful life, the one that's going to bring them into tikkun olam, shalom, nothing missing, nothing broken. This is the one, he fails the test, right? And I say test not because God is literally like putting a test on him, but we see this all over in life, right? We have tests all the time, our ethical tests. We have all these different things that pop up. How do we respond? Israel sometimes chooses the wrong direction. And so this story is a deep warning to Israel. When we come into moments of brokenness, when there is fear, when we're scared, will we go back to Egypt? Will we go back to captivity? Right? Will we go back to where we came from because we're scared? Will we go back to the places we left that didn't fit? Or will we trust the promise? Will we shoulder down and work through it? That's the question for Israel. And I think that's the question for us. It's beautiful, right? What a heavy, heavy story and an odd story. And it gets better, I promise you. The next couple chapters, we're going to see a city turned to salt, burned, and then a woman turned to salt. We're going to see all these stories, again, all deeply, deeply interesting, symbolic warnings, advice, wisdom. I think you're going to love it. But what do we do today? How do we take this home? So first off, how do we face fear? That's the question I had when I was reading this story. How do I face fear in a restorative way rather than reacting knee-jerky, right? Going back to Egypt, forgetting my ethic, forgetting my value. How do I face fear in a positive way? The first thing is I'm learning this. I'm learning to just, when fear strikes, when I hear something crazy on the media, whatever it is, I'm learning to take a timeout. I give myself a timeout. I distract myself from the worry for like 15 minutes or so. If I can take even longer, awesome. I'll walk around the block. I'll make myself a cup of tea. I'll do whatever. You could take a bath. You could do all those kind of things. But just pulling yourself away from it, disengage from it for a moment, right? Disengage from it. Get outside. Get some vitamin D. Breathe. Ground yourself again. And once you do that, you don't respond out of fear. You're not glued to the TV set for days and days and days. You've learned to pull back. All right, I heard something. It's kind of made me freaked out. Pull back a bit. Take time out from it. Don't get so sucked in yet, because that's exactly what these media sources and other people will do. That's exactly what often a problem, a crisis will cause. Learning to pull back for a moment. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's longer. Pull back, take a time out. Another thing I'm learning, breathe through the panic. I had a friend that got into a car accident not that long ago. He said they're driving and this woman nails them from the back, just slams them. And he looks over, his daughter's okay, he's okay. And he said what he did is he just went, he took a breath, didn't panic, didn't freak out, didn't allow his anger that, oh no, my daughter, how dare you do this, didn't go into any of that. He took a breath, didn't panic. He said he even looked over at his daughter and said, hey, sweetie, well, that's your first car accident. Right? He like calmed himself. He breathed. Instead of freaking out, he just breathed slowly, took it all in, and then moved on. Fascinating what can happen when we just stop to breathe. Another concept, after you do that, face your fears, right? Rather than just ignoring them, we do have to step and face them at some point. We can't just keep ignoring them or it's going to keep building, right? So facing them, avoiding fear is only going to make the thing scarier. And so whenever you do face it, find a way, come up with a plan to face the fear. If you're terrified of going outside because of germs, maybe go outside, take a couple walks, right? If you're terrified of facing that boss, practice. Practice facing your boss by talking to your spouse, your partner, your neighbor, a friend. Practice engaging with someone until you feel comfortable enough to go talk to that boss, right? Write out what you're going to say. Those kind of concepts. Practice and then face the fear. It's not going to just go away. Another one, number 4, look at the evidence. I think oftentimes we forget this. We forget that if we could just stop, breathe, and then study, look at the thing, ask deep questions about it, if we could do that, the scary shadow, right? The thing under the bed, it gets smaller and smaller. Sometimes we have to look at the evidence. For example, if you're scared of getting trapped in a lift or like of suffocating, ask yourself if you've ever heard of this happening to someone else, right? Sometimes our fears are so crazy. Just ask yourself, wait a second, has that ever happened to anybody? Like, I know I'm scared about this elevator. How often do elevators fail? Well, look up the statistics. Pretty rare. You're terrified of flying. How often do planes crash? How many flights are actually in the air at once? You'll find next to none, right? Yeah, you have a very, very 99.9% chance of making this flight, right? COVID-19, 99.7% chance of surviving if you get COVID. If you can remember that, you can calm yourself, face the fear, and then you move on. Then you make certain decisions. Whether you do this or that, fine. But you've taken time to engage, look at the actual evidence, the actual science that's not fear-driven. You can move through it with a rational, critical thinking mind. You don't jump into crazy rabbit hole conspiracy theories either direction. You can be grounded, right? You've looked at evidence. You've chosen to use your gray matter. And then second to last, don't try to be perfect, right? You're going to find ways to mess it up no matter what, right? You have this fear, whatever the thing is, you're always going to run into stresses. That's just part of life. And yet we have to remind ourselves, like, bad days, setbacks are always going to happen. It's important to remember life is messy. And so, yes, there's going to be fear. There's going to be brokenness. You may not handle that fear perfectly. Don't beat yourself up over it. Remember, you're not perfect. Perfect is boring. There is no such thing as perfect. So give yourself some grace as you're moving through the challenging moment, the obstacle, the fear that you're having. And then lastly, talk about it. I found over and over again, when I talk about my fears, when I talk to people about the obstacles, the brokenness, the things I'm dealing with, what you find over and over again is when you talk about it, it allows other people to share their stories. And when they share their stories, what you find is you're not alone, right? You find that, hey, other people have been through this too. And if other people have gotten through this, then I know I can get through it too, right? So talk about it with people you trust. When you do, you'll find over and over again, you'll have a community of people walking it with you. And that's where the life is. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this. This was really full of rich concepts here. And it was only, like 10 verses, right? But there's so much depth there. There's actually even more words you could look through all of that. But I think the point was made. Israel, don't react out of fear. Don't forget the past wisdom you've been given. Right? Head toward Eden, not away. Right? Don't assimilate. Don't allow Pharaoh to be the more ethical one, Abraham. Right? So again, I hope you enjoyed this. As always, if you'd like to donate, please consider going to ethos-church.org/donate. That's a tax-deductible donation. Please continue working with us there, getting these messages out. We do these Ethos living rooms. We'd love to hear how you respond to them. We'd love to have you there connected. And always subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. We'd love to continue having you on our YouTube channels. We'd like to continue growing it. So everyone, take care, and we will see you next week as we delve into another really interesting story about Abraham and Lot. In the meantime, everyone, have a great week, and we'll see you later.